Today we have a great person here, Professor Anthony Ocampo. He has his BA from Stanford and an MA from Stanford and the University of California. His PhD at the University of California. He's a sociology professor at Cal Poly Pomona and a Ford Foundation Fellow at the University of California. He's also an author and a speaker. He has many publications and a plethora of presentations regarding intersections of immigration, race, and LGBTQ issues. He's written a couple of books. The book that he's going to be talking about today is The Latinos of Asia, How Filipinos Break the Rules of Race. And he has another one, To Be Brown and Gay in LA, Race and Sexuality in the Immigrant City. I don't know if any of you have ever thought about this, but Filipinos are considered Asians. Yet Filipinos have been ruled for 500 years by the Spanish. They are the only colonial country that was ruled by the Spanish but is not considered Latinos. And so he's going to talk about those intersections today. So please welcome Dr. Anthony Ocampo.
Hi everyone, I'm gonna do my best to hold this mic and hope. There was one time I was giving a talk and I was holding a mic and my bicep totally just wore out and it fell on the floor, but I need to work out more. But do I need to be mic'd or can I just, is it okay, or is it the film? Okay, I'll hold on to the mic. Well, thank you everyone for having me here. I am happy to share that I came to Seattle and I did not fly United Airlines. And so I flew Alaska and it was smooth sailing and I'm really, really happy to be here. I spent the day in Seattle and this city is just amazing and gorgeous and has so many trees that we don't in Los Angeles. And so, yeah, thank you for hosting me. I want to thank the hosts, Cheryl, Doris, Tom, everyone that helped me get set up today. And I want to thank you for spending your mornings. I know when I was in college, 9 a.m. was not my best friend in terms of showing up anywhere. So it really means a lot to me that you're spending the morning here. I'm going to talk about this book, which is right here. And first thing I want to share is that I want to make sure to get people's names because I want to raffle off a couple to the audience after. But I wanted to talk about this book from a very personal point of view, right? I grew up in Los Angeles in a Filipino immigrant family, and I grew up in a neighborhood that was predominantly people of color. So most of my neighbors, most of my elementary school classmates were either Filipino, Asian American, or Mexican American, or some other Latino, right? How many of you grew up in neighborhoods that were pretty diverse? Right? Okay, awesome. And how many of you grew up in immigrant families or immigrant communities? Raise your hands. Oh, awesome. So one of the things that I noticed growing up was that whenever I would be in my neighborhood, I would be around this thriving culture, I would be around multiple languages, but then when I would go to school and I would take social studies class and we would read about American history, there was nothing in the books and there was pretty much nothing from teachers that ever talked about the communities in which I was growing up in or the country that my parents were from. For those that remember kindergarten through 12th grade, how many of you ever remember reading about folks that are part of your community in the curriculum? One person. I'm just curious, what's your name?
Stephanie.
Stephanie, what was your experience reading about what you consider your community in school?
It felt a little disconcerting because it was in different ways than I would be used to hearing about those same people. I was born in LA, grew up in Bakersfield.
Okay.
And so we learned a lot about Cesars and we have a Cesars today. But it was different learning about Cesars in school than like
In the community?
in the community where people have real world concerns.
Right.
Thinking about Cesar Chavez as like an idol, but like a yelling organizer who needs to get
Like someone that calls you to action because we need to get basic resources in order to survive, right? So that's the problem, right? Is that we don't often have the opportunity to read about quote unquote ourselves. And there's something subconscious that happens when you're not able to read about yourself, right? Whenever you're in class and the teacher asks a question, if you never read about your own experience in books, or if you never read about your own experience, or you never hear about your own experience from your teacher, you're gonna think that your perspective, your experiences don't have the same value in the classroom. And that's a shame, because as someone that teaches at a campus that looks very much like this, where the students are, of multiple ethnic and racial backgrounds, I've seen firsthand how important and how impactful it is to have different perspectives in the classroom. It just leads to more critical thought. It leads to more greater awareness about the world that we're living in. And so I've always felt it's important for students to insert their experiences into whatever classroom conversation or classroom papers that you write. So that was my experience. I went from a neighborhood where 1 in every 5, like 20% of the people in my neighborhood were Filipino, to a college where there were literally 20 Filipinos in my freshman class, right? And so I had the same experience of feeling like what it meant to be Filipino, what it meant to be from an immigrant family. I felt like that didn't have any value in the classroom. And so my outlet for me was writing. And I started to write about what life was like growing up. So as Cheryl mentioned, I grew up in a neighborhood that was predominantly, Filipino and Latino, right? But as Cheryl mentioned, Filipinos are considered Asian. And I thought this was a little bit weird, right? Because, going to school, my last name's Ocampo. I had Filipino and Mexican friends whose last names were Rodriguez. We grew up in the Catholic Church together. And so nowhere in any of the books was I ever seeing these close connections between Filipinos and Latinos ever being written about. In fact, there was very little about Filipinos written at all. I'm teaching a Filipino American studies class for the first time, and I always do this survey of asking students, what have you ever read or what have you ever known about Filipino American whatever? And the answers I got were hilarious. I had 2 students say, being Filipino is about that guy from La Bamba, the movie. Or being Filipino is Manny Pacquiao, right? But for the most part, the most common answer I heard from folks is nothing. And so this was something that was really unsettling, because I wanted people to learn about the richness of Filipino American society. So let me just do that quick survey here. About, in this class, what do you know about Filipino Americans? Tell us more about the awesomeness.
Oh gosh. How our family is so important and our history is so important and how we have a lot of fun and we own lumpia and we just love each other.
Have you ever tried that in our minds, everyone has these rules of race that we, whether we realize it or not, we follow, right? So when someone's, like, what is often said after, when you hear someone say, oh, they don't speak Spanish, they're not really, they're not really Latinos, right? Because in our heads, we're like, oh, speaking Spanish is like a implicit rule of what it means to be Latino. How many of you ever watched The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air? Why did they always make fun of Carlton? He wasn't black enough, right? He wasn't black enough. But if you were to see Carlton walking down the street, there would be no doubt that he was black. But why would they say that?
Educated because he carries himself in a certain manner. He doesn't fit the stereotype of what somebody sees.
Right, it doesn't fit the rules of what it means to be black in people's minds. And this is the way race and ethnicity and identity works, is that everybody has a set of rules in their head for what makes racial categories. So, I just had a simple question. I wanted to ask that question that Cheryl was asking earlier. Are Filipino Americans really Asian, right? Are Filipino Americans really Asian? The reason I wanted to ask this is because whether a group fits into these categories, like Asian or Latino or African American, depending on whether they fit in or not, it's going to affect their lives in so many ways. It's going to affect their way they're able to form groups, form friendships. It's going to affect their dating lives. It's going to affect the way they apply for jobs, right? So if Filipinos do or don't feel Asian, it's going to affect their lives in really tangible ways. And let me just tell you a quick story of how this idea of Filipinos being Asian or not being Asian affected my life when I was in school. So, here's a bunch of alcohol, right? I was in my last year at UCLA. It was my 7th year in graduate school. So I already went to like 5 years of college, and I went to graduate school for another 7 years. So at this point, after high school, I went to school for like 12 years. And so while all my friends were at their jobs, making money, I was still in school, being a student, and that's perfectly fine, right? But as most of you know, being in college, it's not the most economically prosperous time in your life. How many of you can agree with that? Right? You're in college, you're hustling, you're always broke, right? And so, again, this was my last year, and I was just walking through the hallways of UCLA, and I remember when I was walking through the halls, I saw a flyer that said, alcohol study. It said, do you drink alcohol? Yes, right? And are you Asian American? Yes, my parents are from the Philippines. So I saw this study, and it said if you qualify for this study, you can make up to $215 in one afternoon. Damn, right? I thought it was a jackpot. So I called up the study coordinator, and I gave her my name, and said I'm available all next week, so I'm going to show up. And then I casually mentioned that I was Filipino, and she said, I'm sorry, but you don't qualify for the study because we can only have Chinese, Japanese, and Korean participants. And I was like, why is that the case? And she's like, well, because we need a genetically similar sample. Right? And you can imagine, I'm in sociology, so we're learning that race is a social construct, not a genetic construct, right? And so what also pissed me off was that she was doing this study in order to make medicine that would be dispensed to Asian Americans. So how are you going to make medicines that are going to be based on just this small subset of Asian Americans, and then disseminate it maybe to larger groups of Asian Americans? It's kind of like how in the development of medicine, a lot of the trials are based almost always on, like back in the day, were based on men, right? They would test medicine out on men, and then they would give them to both men and women in the larger population. It just doesn't apply, right? So I became interested in this question of are Filipinos Asian American? And I also became interested because I felt like when I would talk to Filipinos, they themselves would kind of hesitate when it came to identifying as Asian. So in a survey of Chinese Americans, Vietnamese Americans, and Korean Americans, they asked that question that you all see on the form, what is your racial background? And 95% out of 100 people said, Asian is my racial background. Any guesses for what percentage of Filipinos answered the same question? Yeah. Close. Actually, less than 50. Less than 50%
I get always confused, like, am I Asian? Like, I put in a couple places when the employee sees and then watch me and then tell me, hey, you're not Asian.
Yeah.
So I thought, yeah, Ghana's in the south of Asia, like South Asia.
So people are telling you what you should or shouldn't put, right?
Yeah, so now I get confused sometimes, like, what should I put?
And what would be the other option?
Other?
Other, right? Other people have experiences of being like, oh, I don't know what boxes I should check, or I don't know what group I belong to. Yeah.
Well, it's a little different, but kind of similar to what you were saying. But I grew up in Washington, and
Is it working? Okay, yeah.
I grew up in Washington, so a lot of Asians would hang out together.
Mm-hmm.
And then I moved to Hawaii for 2 years.
Yeah.
And I figured it was kind of the same way, and Hawaii is more diverse.
Right.
But when I tried to hang out in Hawaii, when I tried to hang out with what I would consider my peers, just like everyone, they would be like, no, we're hanging out together, but you're Filipino.
Wow. Wow. Is anyone familiar, who's been to Hawaii? You know, what it means to be Filipino in Seattle or Washington, it's so different than what it means to be Filipino in Hawaii, right? In Hawaii, the status of Filipinos is very different because of the type of Filipino immigrants that came. They were considered at the bottom, right? And so to be Filipino there was a very stigmatized identity. So that's the other thing too about these rules of racial identity is that they can change. They can change depending on what neighborhood or what city that you're in. Everything okay? Okay. So the question is why? Why do Filipinos not identify as Asian, right? And again, this is not just about Filipinos. This is so that we can learn about how racial identity works in America. And so what we learned is that there are rules of race that, you know, we kind of have in our heads. The person that was talking to you when you were applying for a job, in their mind, Asian meant this, or that, right? In Hawaii, Filipino meant this versus what Hawaii meant in Seattle, right? In other words, race, the way we think about these rules of race, they're kind of like a constellation, right? A constellation is just a bunch of different set of stars that, you know, like the Big Dipper, the Little Dipper. When you put them together, you kind of can identify what it is, right? If so, in the Big Dipper or the Little Dipper, if you see a single star, you're not going to know that's the Big or Little Dipper, right? But if you see all the stars together as a constellation, you'll see, oh, okay, that's the Big Dipper. Race kind of functions the same way. We look at things like what people look like, how people dress, how people talk. We look at their last names like Fernandez, right? And we start to make these conclusions about where people fit. What box should they be into? That's just a natural part of the way the human brain works. We categorize, right? We categorize because we have to make sense of the world. Of course, the context matters, so right, it depends on what area you're in. The rules can change. I can tell you that what it means to be someone who's Afghan American here, it's not going to be the same thing in New York. It's not going to be the same thing in the South. It's not going to be the same thing in Middle America, right? And race, but at the same time, race is something that's ubiquitous. In other words, that's just a fancy word of saying like race affects all different aspects of our daily life, whether we realize it or not, right? What are some examples of the way race might affect our lives without realizing it or not? Think about when you turn on the TV, right? When you turn on the TV, if you're white, you can watch television shows where people that look like you are president, they're lawyers, they're law enforcement, you know, they're all different sorts of roles and jobs that you can see. And if you're a kid, you can think, oh, okay, those are jobs that I can aspire to, right? If you're Asian American, you turn on the TV and what do you see? Huh? Cooks. Nowadays you see cooks. Back when I was a kid, you didn't see anything. What other things did you see? You see Glenn from The Walking Dead, maybe, right? Uh-huh.
See, like it's obviously a Filipino actor who's playing a Latino on TV.
Yeah, you'll see a Filipino actor sometimes playing a Latino. or a waiter, right? But you don't see a Filipino actor being president of the United States or being like lawyers or doctors or anything like that, right? And so if you're a Filipino kid growing up, maybe subconsciously you're going to think, okay, that's not something that I can aspire to do, right? So that's an example how race might affect your life. They did this study once where they compared, they sent out job applications, resumes, and they had resumes that they made them exactly the same, except on some of the resumes, they named the people Emily and Greg. And in another set of resumes, they look exactly the same. They changed the name to Lakeisha and Tyrone. And what happened was that Emily and Greg got twice as many job application callbacks as Lakeisha and Tyrone, even though they had the exact same resume. Why would that be the case, you think? Yeah? Huh? Bias, right? So the names Lakeisha and Tyrone, they signal to people that those are minorities, right? And the implicit bias started to happen without employers even realizing that it was the case, right? They might say things like, oh, they don't necessarily fit the culture of the job. They won't fit in at this workplace. And all these things that can happen in people's mind. And anyway, so as a sociologist, one of the things we need to do is that we need to be very clear about how we answered our research questions. So what I did is, I interviewed Filipino Americans in Los Angeles. I interviewed men and women. I wanted to get people of different class backgrounds, different neighborhoods. I interviewed Filipinos that grew up around Latinos, those that grew up around whites, some that grew up around African Americans. I wanted to get a sense of Filipinos from all different types of backgrounds. And I did most of this in Los Angeles. And so I didn't want to just ask that question of like, what is your racial background, right? Because I think all of us in here would agree that our identity can't be constrained to just a box on a form, right? We're much more about that. And so what I wanted to ask instead, especially in a city as diverse as LA, as I asked Filipinos, instead of asking them, what's your racial background? Because that's only going to give me limited answers. I wanted to ask them, which group do you feel closest to, right? Which group do you feel closest to? You might say you're Asian on a box, but it doesn't necessarily mean you feel close with other Asian Americans. So that's what I wanted to get at. So I asked them this question. And when I asked the question, which group do you feel closest to, I got answers that were really interesting. And I distinctly remember the answer of Leah, who's at the time in her mid-20s. She was teaching in a city called Carson, California. And I asked her, which group do you feel closest to? And she kind of hesitated, and she said, well, it's kind of hard to consider us Asian because we're the only Asian group that's been colonized by Spain for over 300 years, right? So I was like, wow. And what's interesting is that when I asked Filipinos about identity, a lot of them would talk about colonialism, even though they never took a Filipino history class or they had maybe never gone to the Philippines. A lot of them talked about colonialism and how that affected identity. So she said it's kind of hard because Filipinos been colonized by Spain for over 300 years. We're more Latino than Asian is what she said. And I thought that was interesting. And what she said next is something I heard time and time again from the people that I interviewed. She said, Filipinos are the Mexicans of Asia. I heard a couple laughs. Why are people laughing? How many of you have ever heard this catchphrase? I want to hear where did you, because I'm from LA, so the fact that you have heard this and you live in Washington just trips me out. So what are some, I want to hear what happened. Anybody, yeah.
I have a lot of Filipino friends, and I grew up around a lot of Filipinos. The neighborhood I grew up in was dominant.
Uh-huh.
So a lot of them, when I asked them, like, oh, so I noticed that your last name is just like our other friend who is actually Mexican American.
Really?
And they were like, oh yeah, we're Mexicans of Asia. And I'm like, oh, that's cool.
That's funny. Other stories. I saw your hand go up as well. Yeah.
So I have to go to the Chinese.
Uh-huh.
And my cousin had a Chinese side, just told me I'm a Mexican of Asia.
You're the Mexican of Asia? You had your hand up as well. What?
I actually heard it from my mom, because my mom is Korean.
Oh.
And my mom thinks like Koreans are like the best race of
Uh-huh.
Asia. And I
That's an interesting way of thinking about it, right? Because you would think like all these different ethnic groups, they're all united under the umbrella of Asian American, but that's not actually the case, right? If you go to Asia, you'll see Filipinos, the type of jobs that they occupy in Asia is stuff like domestic workers, custodial jobs, manual labor where people would consider them of a lower rank. And that sometimes leads people to say things like that because they want to, they have to explain that Filipinos are a little bit different, right? So anyway, what I realized is that even though we think of colonialism as something that happened hundreds of years ago, what we have to realize is that colonialism affects our lives even today. And the Filipinos are a clear example where colonialism affects their lives even to this day, right? So for those who are unfamiliar with Philippine history, let me give you a quick 30-second summary of what that's all about. The Philippines was colonized by Spain for 300 years. So they say that Filipinos spent 300 years in the convent and 50 years in Hollywood, right? Because it was also colonized by the Americans for another 50 years. And what that means is that, if you go to the Philippines, it's a very Catholic country. If you look at Filipino languages, there's a lot of Spanish words that are in the Filipino language. If you look at Filipinos, like a group, like Filipino families and their last names are often Spanish. So my last name's Ocampo. On my mom's side, there's last names like Rodriguez and Torres. Those are the type of last names that Filipinos have. And these are what we call cultural residuals. It's like cultural residue. You know when like it rains and there's like residue on your windshield, right? That's like leftovers. So you could think of colonialism as having residue on the modern day culture of Filipinos and Filipino Americans, because you still see those cultural elements alive in their everyday lives today. And those cultural elements are important because they affect the way other people categorize each other by race. So if you were to, say, get a job application, you're working in HR, and someone applied for a job with the last name Torres, you're automatically going to think what? Asian? Probably not. You'll probably think what? Hispanic, Latino. If you see the last name Chan, you'll think Chinese, right? If you see the last name Williams, you might not think Asian. You might not think Latino. You might think American, right? These names affect how people categorize others. Anyway, how did colonialism come up, right? It's one of these things where you can't just, like, I'm not going to go up to, is it Patrick? Yeah. I'm not going to go up to Patrick and say, Patrick, how does colonialism affect your life, right? Because that's not a sensible thing that people would necessarily talk about it in like everyday conversation. But what's interesting is that if you have your sociological imaginations on, if you have that lens on where you know the way that race works and identity works, you can start to look out for the way colonialism affects people's lives. And it affects Filipinos' lives in 4 ways. It affected them in terms of their phenotype, that's like what they look like. It affects them in terms of language, religion, and their social networks. So I'm going to try to get through as many of these, but if I don't, it's okay. I just want you to give the opportunity to put these up here. And if you have questions, if I don't get to something, please feel free to ask it during the question and answer. So phenotype, it's what you look like, right? Your hair texture, what your skin color is, the way your eyes are shaped. When Filipinos would talk about identity, and I would ask them, hey, do you feel Asian? Some of them would say, well, I don't really feel Asian because I'm too dark, right? Or I don't feel Asian because my eyes aren't shaped in a particular way. And what was crazy is that the way Filipinos looked often determined whether they felt like they belonged within Asian American circles. So I remember I spoke to Angie, and who's a salesperson that worked in LA, and she said, well, I have friends that look Chinese or they look Japanese and they have that Chinese blood. Maybe they have more of that Asian look, but I have dark skin and I have slanted eyes, so I don't really feel comfortable identifying as Asian. sometimes the background of where people lived affected the way they thought about identity. So there were some Filipinos where if they were in Koreatown, people would think they're Asian. But then if they went to like East LA, which is a predominantly Mexican neighborhood, people would start speaking to them in Spanish automatically. And it could be the same person driving just 20 minutes away from each other. So Cesar, here's the guy from La Bamba, by the way, Lou Diamond Phillips. Cesar, who's a hotel manager in LA, he said, people assume that I'm Mexican because we have that Spanish blood, right? We have that Spanish blood, we look more Hispanic. People assume I'm Latino or Hispanic, is what he said. And this is something that he said happens to his cousins, it happens to his siblings, it happens to his own parents, where when they're walking down the street and people don't know them, people automatically assume that they're Mexican American. And you gotta imagine, there are so many interactions that we have where people don't actually get the chance to get to know you, right? Interactions with authorities, interactions with police, interactions with teachers, in business settings, right? And you can imagine if Cesar and his family are perceived to be Mexican American, it would affect all of those things in ways that are very different from other Asian Americans. Of course, we know that race is not just about what you look like, it's also about language. If you were to go to LA, and you go to like traditional Asian neighborhoods, when we think of Asian languages, we often think of what? Huh? I heard it over here. Characters, right? And this is something Filipinos talked about. Like, oh, real Asians use characters, but we Filipinos, our words look more like this. This is a popular restaurant in Los Angeles. For those who have taken intro Spanish, what does this mean? Barrio, neighborhood, fiesta, party, right? And they would compare Filipino businesses or Filipino words with, traditional Asian spaces like Chinatowns or Koreatowns. What's interesting is that in Los Angeles, I know that the Latino population in Washington is not as large as Los Angeles, but in LA, 1 in every 2 people that lives in LA is Latino or Hispanic. 1 in every 2. And in the neighborhoods that a lot of Filipinos grew up in, there were at least 30 to 40% Mexican American or Latino. And what this meant is that growing up in these neighborhoods, Filipinos would hear Spanish all the time, wherever they went. Spanish was just an everyday part of their everyday lives. And what would happen is that they would compare the Spanish words that they would hear out in the neighborhood to the type of words that their parents would use at home. So everyday words in Filipino languages like Tagalog, everyday words they overlap with Spanish. So if I were to point at my shoes, in Tagalog and in Spanish, these are zapatos. If I'm going to point at my pants, these are pantalones. If I'm looking at that table, what? Huh? Mesa. Chair, silla or silla in Tagalog, right? Shirt, camiseta. Skirt, falda. Fork, tenedor. Spoon, cuchara. Plate, plato, right? So Filipinos heard these words in Tagalog growing up because their families were immigrants. And then they'd go out into the neighborhood and hear these Spanish words and be like, wait a second. Those words are pretty much the same, right? And they're like, why on earth is our language does it sound so similar to their language, even though these countries are like an oceans apart? And that's when Filipinos would, again, put 2 and 2 together about colonialism. They needed an explanation for why this was the case, and Spanish colonialism was the reason that helped bridge these 2 groups together. Again, last names are important, right? Last names are important because a lot of Filipinos have these last names that overlap with Latinos or Mexican American classmates that they had at school or neighbors that they had living next door. If I were to say that my last name was Fernandez and Patrick's last name was Fernandez, what is the assumption you would make? Huh? What? I'm sorry, what? Same ancestor, or what? Related. We're cousins. we're brothers, we're related, right? And this is what Filipinos and Latinos as well in LA would say. Oh, my last name's Fernandez, your last name's Fernandez. We're like cousins of colonialism, right? We're like cousins of colonialism. They would say sometimes it was worse than that. Sometimes it would be like, oh man, your last name's Torres, my last name's Torres. We both got fucked by Spain. They would say things like that. And as much as colonialism was a very hideous and ugly historical part of both Latin American and Philippine history, for whatever reason, it bonded Filipinos and Latinos together in schools and neighborhoods and everyday lives. And last names actually, as much as we don't often think about the role of last names, it played a really prominent role in that. Of course, religion comes into play. Philippines is a very Catholic country. If you go to Asia, Philippines is the only Asian country that's predominantly Catholic. How many of you grew up Catholic in here? So for those that didn't grow up Catholic, Catholicism is a very visual religion, right? It's a very, there's a lot of iconography, a lot of saints. And if you go to like Mexico, you go to Latin America, and you go to the Philippines, what you'll notice is that you'll see Jesus and the Virgin Mary everywhere, right? It's just sort of evident, you can see it. And this is what people would say. They'd say, well, when I think of Filipinos and Latinos, I don't think of, when I think of other Asians, I think of Buddha, but not Jesus or Mary. Right? It's very stereotypical notions of what it means to be religious in Asians. Or other people would say, oh, when I go to my Latino friends' houses, they have the Virgin Mary, they have saints, they have pictures of Jesus everywhere. And the visualization of, like this is where what ethnicity is often very visual. Because if you see these like similar images in people's homes, you're gonna think there's a common link between two of you. So anyway, all of this is to say that, religion, language, history, phenotype, this all plays into the way social networks work, right? It is very often the case. If you go to any high school or any school throughout the country, or most like basic like friendship circles, in America, it's still the case that people tend to befriend others of their same ethnic or cultural group. In fact, it's still the case that people still marry other people of their same ethnic or racial group. So with the Filipinos, they would often talk about how they would enter Latino circles or like their Latino friends' houses, and they would say there's these commonalities that we feel, right? Mexican Americans that I spoke to would say, you know what's interesting, when I invite my Filipino friends over, I just say, oh, this is my friend Janice. But if I'm inviting my Chinese friend over, I say to my parents, this is my Chinese friend Alice, right? It was almost as if Filipinos flew under the radar in Latino circles. And this is something that's not necessarily new. This is something that's very historic in nature. So if you've ever heard of the United Farm Workers, right? This is something you mentioned, Cesar Chavez. Cesar Chavez's United Farm Workers was originally a coalition between Filipino and Mexican farm workers in the middle of the 20th century. So again, Filipinos, they blend into these social circles that are predominantly Latino, and the fact that they kind of fly under the radar is the part that I thought was really interesting, right? Because when we think about who gets to participate in social groups, who gets to participate in these like cultural clubs, being able to fly under the radar matters, right? Or if you're running for office, if you're someone that's running for office, you're gonna need to rely on connecting with other people. So if you look like the people that you're trying to get, whether you're trying to get their votes, that's gonna matter a huge deal. So in my head, I always wonder if a Filipino ever wants to run for office, they should really talk about their connections to Latino and other Latinos and Mexican Americans, because it's gonna really help their ability to represent the larger community. Nowadays, we have things like social media, right? We have social media, and if you ever go on like these amazing like YouTube videos, there's all these cool things where people will show you like the similarities between Filipinos and Mexicans. And do you mind if I share a quick video, real quick? Okay. So let me just show you a quick video, and then I'm gonna open it up for Q&A. But because I think this video really characterizes what I'm trying to show. Hold on.
for the wedding, I was thinking about this as a seating chart. That's the bride side, and that's the groom side. Oh my gosh, I forgot to add all of our tios, tias, titas, and titos.
Now it's perfect. So that's my aunt from my mom's side. That's my uncle from my mom's side. And that's my uncle, mom's side.
Wait, so how many brothers and sisters does your mom have?
She's an only child.
So who are they?
That's not really my aunt. It's just like my mom's close friend. Actually, they're not even like that close. Actually, they're not even friends.
It's just like Mexicans and Filipinos call literally everyone their family, even if you just met them once. Hi, Auntie!
We just met that person.
We work hard to provide you with the most magical moment for your big day. Do you know what ambience you're going for?
Well, we don't want like a formal wedding.
Yeah, something just a bit more relaxed than what everyone normally does.
I do not understand your request.
Like, no tux, no dress.
Camisa?
Yeah.
Just a camisa,
Yeah.
But we still want it to feel like a wedding, so we wanted to come in riding a...
Bicicleta.
No, but that is a word we share. Like a...
Yeah.
Oh, caballo.
Yes,
Yeah.
caballo, yeah.
And for food, we're thinking since Mexicans and Filipinos eat rice all the time, maybe we can do some sort of rice dish or something.
Ah, puto.
You
Yeah,
watch your
perfect.
mouth.
How's my tan?
Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today in the sight of Dios.
Wait, espérame, hey boy.
Sorry, Filipino time.
Mexican.
Let's continue. If anyone objects to this union, speak now or forever hold your peace.
What are you doing here? Hey, nobody invited you. Go home.
God bless America.
You got a lot of nerve showing up here after what you did to both of us. The lying, the stealing.
The appropriation. I got you.
Why are you bringing up all this stuff? Huh? Look what I did for both of you. You both speak the same language. Kind of. You both have a similar last name. And I thought both of you fight passionately for what you believe in. If anything, you should be like. Huh?
This is for colonizing us, and we didn't want to be colonized.
This is for stealing our gold and starting wars with our natives.
And this is for that stupid left.
Okay, I'll go.
You know, we do have a lot in common.
But we're still a little bit different. And I like it that way.
This is so cheesy.
Cheesy?
Oh, puto por everyone!
Watch your mouth.
I'll take one.
That's right, it's a dish. I tend to get angry. I have anger issues. You know what? This is off. I'm done.
So I'm told we had to take a quick break, but I'm hoping people can stay for some Q&A, and I'm going to pass it on to Cheryl. I just want to open it up to Q&A about anything related to the actual book or to just personal questions, or if any writers are in the room or creatives, I would love to. I love talking about the creative process as well. So, any folks out there got questions? Yeah. Yes, please. Hi.
Hi, my name is Jeremy.
Hi, Jeremy.
I came here from the Philippines when I was 12, and then so me and my family talk about this intersectionality a lot. And one of the things that like we noticed as I was like growing up here was like a lot of Filipinos who came here like before the 90s and raised their Filipino kids. They were like to their kids they were like, oh no, you're American now, so don't even learn the language. Like, don't consider yourself you don't even consider yourself Filipino. But now, like, now that I'm meeting those people and they're growing up and they're also having kids, they have this yearning and they really want to get to know us and like they have this yearning to get to know about being Filipino. And so when I was going to school, like there are like Asian groups and Mexican groups and Black groups, but then there are Filipinos are scattered all over. So do you think that's the reason why, like, of like when we come here to the U.S., do you think sort of like the not being proud of your culture, like of like Filipinos before the 90s is like the reason why we kind of segregate ourselves?
Yeah, that's a really great question, Jeremy. That's a really tough question as well. I've grappled with this a lot, right? Because if you try to get people to read about Filipino stuff or try to join Filipino organizations, some people are like, I don't want to do that, right? With immigrants that come to the United States, not just Filipinos, but all, I think that at the heart, immigrants come to the US and they have these humongous dreams and these humongous hopes for their children, no matter what background there is. And in their heads, they want to try to maximize their kids' opportunities and minimize the heartbreak that maybe they themselves have felt. And so I think a lot of Filipino immigrants and other immigrants, they grow up with this, or they come here with this idea that the more American you are, the better, right? Without realizing that, hey, your kid's brown-skinned. Your kid's gonna maneuver the world very differently, even if he speaks or she speaks perfect English, right? And so it's really important that instead of pushing that to the side, we actually try to embrace it. I think what you're saying about the 90s, like this interesting observation you have, is really cool because I think what's changed is that with social media, what's great about social media is that anybody can post stuff on YouTube and start to define what it means to be cool, right? And there's so many phenomenal Filipino American artists, dancers, DJs, musicians that are posting themselves on YouTube. And what I'm seeing is these younger Filipino Americans that are like kids. Their heroes aren't like stuff on TV. Their heroes are Filipinos they see on YouTube. And I think that's phenomenal. And I think that the more we just unapologetically put ourselves out there and be like, yo, this is us, that is gonna be the thing that, even if it affects just one kid, that has ripple effects that you won't even begin to realize. So I love that question, Jeremy. Thanks for asking it. But yeah, I saw a hand up here. Hi, Ms. Stephanie. Nice to meet you.
So I'm kind of curious about your experience being a graduate student, a person of color in academia.
Yeah.
And I mean, for our students, but also for some of us as professionals that are maybe going back to get master's or PhDs.
Yeah. That's a really great question. So I'm Filipino American. I also identify as gay, queer, and so let's just say there's not a whole lot of role models out there for me to look to, which can make academia a really weird place. Again, when you crack open books, when you look at who your teachers are, they don't often look like you, and sometimes when you say things, they don't necessarily get what you're saying, right? If you talk about growing up in an immigrant family or growing up queer, like, it's not always the teachers that are gonna get why you're sharing what you're sharing, and that can be very difficult. One thing I would say is that if you're a woman, if you're a person of color, if you're a LGBTQ person or all of the above, right? Because intersectionality exists. The way you feel and the way you're thinking is the way you feel and the way you think, and don't let anybody ever question that. Because I think that academia is situated, it's structured in a way where it makes you question the thoughts that you have and the feelings that you have, and I think that's fucked up, right? So, first of all, acknowledge that the thoughts, the feelings that you have value. They have something to offer your intellectually. They have something to offer intellectually, but they also have something to offer on a community level, right? Because if you're willing to embrace everything about who you are in terms of your unique perspective as a woman of color, if you're queer, there is some kid out there or some person that is not where you're at watching you from a distance that is gonna see what you do and be like, it's okay for me to act that same way too, or to think that same way too. And that's why I feel like we, as educators, we gotta model that behavior of being unapologetic, so that students, more critical mass can build to just infiltrate and make the academy what it promises to be, which is an opportunity, a place for opportunity to happen. So. Huh? Oh my gosh. So I mentioned that I was at Stanford and I was one of the few Filipinos there. And I wanted to quit. I wanted to leave because I felt like nobody could understand where I was coming from. In fact, you know, I remember I would be in my college dorm and I would make jokes and they would fall flat. And I'm like, am I not funny? You know? Or I would say things and people would be like, why are you always talking about race? Why do you always talk about race? And I'm like, I grew up in the time of O.J. Simpson and the Los Angeles riots, the Los Angeles insurrection. Of course, I can't help but think about race. I grew up watching A Different World. That was my favorite show growing up, right? Anyone remember this show? Oh, thank God. Okay. I grew up thinking about race. That's just who I am, but I was made to feel ashamed of it, right? I was made to think it was something bad to talk about. Don't even get me started on LGBTQ stuff. I wasn't even there yet. So, because of one human being, Dawn Mabalan, this woman who was doing her PhD at Stanford, she taught a history class. And the entire class was about reading about Filipino American history and Filipino American experiences. And all of a sudden, my life growing up eating adobo and lechon, or like going to the Philippines and having family that we would think about sending them like money or chocolates or cereal, all of those weird experiences that I thought had no value at the university, all of a sudden became valuable because one person told me, hey, that shit matters, right? We learned something from that shit. And had I not had that one person telling me, hey, that stuff matters, this book would never have ever been, I would not even be standing here today. So it just really goes to show you the value of one person that's willing to look at you like straight in the eye and say everything about what you think and everything about what you feel and everything about what you say, that has something to teach the world, and you owe it to the world to share that with them. So, yeah. Oh, yes. I'm sorry, the book incident, but yeah. Uh-huh. How funny. Yeah.
But even in class, even in discussions such as these, even in my sociology class, there's such a huge disconnect with those model Asians. So
Yeah.
what do you think, or how do you think we bridge that or stop that?
Yeah, you know, that's hard because this model minority thing has been killing Asians for so long, right? For the Asians that feel like they fit in with the model minority, they'll ride it, and then it ends up excluding other Asians that don't feel that they match up. For the ones that don't match up, model minority stereotypes it could lead to depression, it could lead to suicidal ideation, it leads to all these negative emotional effects, not to mention like not having a sense of belonging. I think that when it comes to this, you know, model minority stereotype, we need to do everything that we can to provide data and this is why I love sociology. You provide data and you provide stories that say, hey, that's really a damaging stereotype that has only negative effects and no positive effects, right? And it's hard because we're so used to putting those two things together. When I was interviewing Filipinos, they were like, Asian, model minority, right? It's hard to disentangle. But I think that one of the things that helps, as much as society doesn't seem like they care about this, is facts, right? We have to be really committed and invested in facts, not fake news, not alternative facts, right? And for the people that still don't manage to feel like the facts don't convince them, this is where I think the importance of storytelling can be really revolutionary. And let me give you a quick example. I'm gay, right? And when I first came out to my immigrant family, like all those people, I would, of course it was a little bit of a conflict because, again, they're immigrants. They came to this country with big hopes. They wanted me to marry a nice girl, and that wasn't in my plans, right? And so I would lay down all these facts. I'd be like, look, like same-sex relationships, people can be just as happy. Look, when people come out, it has these positive effects on their self-esteem. Look, when you think about raising children, there's data that shows that same-sex relationships, parenting has just as positive an environment as heterosexual parenting, right? Sometimes the facts aren't enough. And so what I started to do is I did this research project where I would interview gay kids from immigrant families, and I heard these really heartbreaking stories. And the more I shared these heartbreaking stories over and over with people, it started to convince my parents, it started to convince like immigrant relatives that, hey, maybe trying to get our kids to become straight or trying to, sweep it under the rug is not actually the best thing. And it was those stories that really changed their mind more than facts. So I think with those, this is where like YouTube, reading, television shows like Crazy Ex-Girlfriend, anything that just unravels stereotypes is always a good thing. I think about like my friends who are African American and how they love this show on HBO called Insecure. Have anyone heard of this? Yes. Oh my God, this show's hilarious, right? But it's about this show is just about the joys of living in South Los Angeles as a black person, right? And part of the revolutionary aspect of this show is it's about the joy of blackness in LA, when all the images that we're used to are negative, right? And so it's been such a powerful show because people are like, oh, there's diversity in this experience. I think that's the challenge for you is like, how can you show people that there's diversity? There's working class Koreans that aren't going to college. There's Filipinos, and there's people of all backgrounds that are doing well, that aren't doing well. We got to share those stories. So, yes.
So I was sitting, we were doing study circles.
Yeah.
And so we have the Asians in my group, and so one of the girls, she was really like connected to what we're talking about in class. And she kind of like we were asking her, are you okay? He's not really engaging and stuff. And she was like, well, this doesn't really affect me. I don't see what you guys are talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, but you're just like us, and you should have not exactly the same experience, but if you're
Yeah.
and so that kind of like really frustrated me because I'm like, wow, like you're really been taught to not see how this also affects
Yeah.
you, even though you are that Asian, that white favor and all that stuff. Even though so it was really hard for me to hear that she considered herself.
And you know what? That's the hard part is that we only have so much energy to expend, and we got to pick our battles, right? We got to pick our battles. Sometimes, so for example, I have a student who is an ex-Marine, who is all about Black Lives Matter and is all about keeping people accountable for abuses in law enforcement and keeping people accountable for racism, right? And what I realize is that as an ex-Marine, he's able to talk to people that are ex-military in a way that I would never have the ability to do so because of his background. And so maybe in that case, you got to think of who is someone, maybe I can't convince this person, but maybe I have someone in my close circle that can, whom they would listen to in a little bit of a different way. It's not that they listen to them and not you, it's just sometimes it takes a while, right? It's hard to change people's minds and hearts. And sometimes all we can do is lay out the info, lay out the story, and hope that when their moment happens, then they'll remember what you offered them many years back, right? I think this incident with United Airlines is a clear example where it's like, yo, Asian Americans, you're not exempt. You can still get dragged off a plane in your 60s with all the credentials in the world. You know? None of those credentials are gonna erase the fact that you don't have the same racial privilege as other people. You know, could you imagine if a white woman of that same age was dragged off a plane in that particular manner? It's impossible. We can't, right? It's because of that person's particular shade of brown, and you know, and the way we see Asians as one-dimensional that allowed those folks to drag him off the plane the way they did, right? And the more we can make folks of color, queer folks, women, the more we can make them multi-dimensional and complicated and fully human in people's minds, I think the less those type of incidents would happen. I hope they just go away, but you know, yeah. Yeah. Oh, I don't think, so I get this question, like, so what's the answer? Are Filipinos Asian or Latino? And I'm like, you know, because the problem is if they get looped in, this actually was gonna happen in the 1960s, right? They used to call Latinos Spanish surname people. That was the label that they used. And then they changed it to Hispanic and then changed it to Latino. So the issue is that if Filipinos get looped into the Latino box, what does that mean? They're gonna be an even smaller minority with an even larger category. And I think that the way I think about this Filipino-Latino thing is less about changing boxes and more about what is the potential of highlighting these connections with other groups beyond what you think people are. So there is, what I think the Filipino cases teaches us is that, hey, Filipinos are Asian, yes, that's the box they will probably stay in for a while. But let's think about how we can link them up to other groups as a way of practicing our cross-cultural understanding. It gives us practice to think about, hey, how can we think about the relationship between African Americans and Asians or Latinos and whites? Like, it gives us practice to link up to groups outside of our box. So, other questions about anything under the sun? Yeah, Jeremy.
Can you talk more about what you were talking about earlier? About like you were reading about the history of like other Filipinos as well. Where is that?
Yeah. So, Jerry, where is Fonz? What is the address? This is the person. There are thousands of books waiting to be written based off the documents of this Filipino American National Historical Society. So, Dorothy Cordova is this amazing spitfire of a woman who has more energy than everyone in this room put together. And she, you know, she's there every single day, and she has developed this archive that has been around for 35 years this October. And it has everything under the sun you could think of that's Filipino American. There's interview tapes of Filipinos that came to the United States, like tapes, like you remember cassettes? Yeah, cassettes. Cassette tapes of Filipino Americans from the 1960s that came here. She has this box of, oh my gosh, these Filipino soldiers that trained in Australia. They wrote these journals about what their lives were like being in the United States Army, right? Fighting for the American cause. In these amazing journals, it's like I dreamed. They say things like I dreamed to be an American. We believe in the American cause for freedom, right? All these amazing stories that you would probably you never get to read in your own social studies books at all. And they're just waiting for folks like yourselves to go in there and make the story. You know, you don't have to write a book, right? You don't have to write a book, but you can go to that archive. You can just, with permission of Auntie Dorothy is how she goes by, Auntie Dorothy. You can go there and just read stories. And honestly, if you read stories, you telling those stories to your family or to your friends, or posting one little thing on Facebook about what you learned, you just have no idea what that could do for people in your social networks. I'm a big believer in the power of story. And I feel like whatever tiny amount of like window of time you have that you can get one of those stories out there, I highly recommend doing it. You know, it's just it affects you in ways that you can't put a price on, and you can't. It's like words can't describe that feeling of knowing that you're part of something that's larger than yourself. So, yeah, let's have one more question. Yes.
First of all, I just want to say thank you for this innovative work. I think it's what our people need.
Thank you, man.
Start to take steps forward. And as you know, in our community, there's a lot of, I'm not sure if you've seen the movie Get Out.
Not yet. It's on my queue.
Well, there's this concept of the sunken place.
Uh-huh.
Essentially, in the movie, it says that whiteness has essentially, literally, taken fractions of our brain, removed it from our own consciousness,
Mm-hmm.
and then we have learned to adopt really the mindset and the literal memories of whiteness.
Yeah.
Behind closed doors in our community, there's a lot of anti-blackness. Behind closed doors in our community, sometimes we have grandmas, aunties who tell us to stay out of the sun
Mm-hmm.
because of this colonialism
The colorism.
that you've so powerfully dissected. And there's a movement in California, in Hawaii, in Guam, to kind of reclaim our Filipino indigeneity.
Mm-hmm.
Ilocano, Pangasinan, and so forth. And there's a movement in California to have Pacific Islander Filipinos counted as Pacific Islanders. And the main argument is because they are still in a cycle of colonialism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
According to your data, 55% do not see themselves.
You know what they picked? The other 55? They picked Pacific Islander.
And I say this freely. I'm 38 years old, so we're close in age. And oftentimes, to be honest, I feel that one of the biggest reasons we cannot advance
Uh-huh.
is because Asians won't let us go. They simply won't let us go. Partly because the data helps them, because our data is so poor. Filipino American men, one of the fastest growing dropout populations of colleges. So my question, my brother, is what do you think it would take for our people to reimagine ourselves the way we want to?
Oh, man. I feel like I could have another couple hours here.
For example, our people are starting to tattoo again.
Yeah.
Growing this black hair back out again, not dyeing it.
Yeah.
Not using skin lightening products, which are the number one product in the Philippines.
Oh, yeah.
Skin
We
lightening
go to a
products.
Filipino store here. There's a couple, I'm sorry, it's $1 billion industry in not just the Philippines, but all of Asia. So I think the one tiny part that I can easily answer about data, there is a existing movement among all Asian Americans, not just Filipinos, to disaggregate data, to collect data that is more reflective of ethnic groups. Because, for example, like doctors tell me this all the time, they talk about how the diabetes rates of Filipinos are different than other Asians, right? And the like breast cancer rates of Filipinos are different from other Asians, and that's because disease is behavioral, right? A lot of disease is about the cultural behaviors that exist within communities, not about what continent you're from, right? Even though a lot of medical people still think that way. So that's one. Disaggregation is an ongoing movement that has a lot of momentum in places like California. So I would stay up on those on Twitter and other AAPI orgs that are actively trying to say, let's disaggregate. Because anyone that knows statistics knows that it's just a simple set of commands on a statistical program to reaggregate. So disaggregation is not even a thing. In fact, Filipinos in California lobbied to disaggregate themselves from Asian Americans in the 1980s, which is why we have so much data on Filipinos in California versus other places. And it's not a bad thing. It doesn't mean that you hate other Asian. It's just data. We need data. The more info, the better. Now, with respect to what you said about indigeneity, I wish that if I were to. So there's the issue. I'm like the one, like in sociology, there's like a handful of people that study Filipino Americans, right? We only get about 180 to 200 pages to write a book, right? But for whatever reason, because there's so few Filipino American sociologists, people are always like, you didn't do this. You didn't, like, and I wish, my dream is to have an entire research center that I could direct for someone that they're strictly gonna write about this amazing thing that is like Filipino Americans exploring indigeneity, right? I think that that's a emerging topic of interest that's been happening with Native Hawaiian research, Pacific Islander research, even Mexican American research. People have looked at the importance and the positive impact of exploring indigeneity. I can't wait for that project on Filipinos to get off the ground. And who's to say that like that could be your thing, you know, where you blog about it, you tweet about it. Like, I think that in the marketplace of ideas, something like that would gain some traction, because I think Filipinos, as like we kind of talked about earlier, are starving to have public images and cultural representations that are about them, as opposed to what you said, which is like white folks telling you what you are, or other folks telling you what you are. That's kind of why I wrote this book, because I felt like people were telling me who I was, and I'm a stubborn guy, and I hate that. So I was like, F you, right? So I started to take control of like the story that I felt my life was about and just write it. And thankfully, I'm so privileged to come to new places and have these convos that I was telling folks it's just the beginning, right? This is a book. This should never be the book, right? This is a book that I hope will catalyze folks, no matter what your background is, to just fucking write your stories. And yeah. Thanks for that closing question. That was a perfect one.